unrolling it with that hot wire, using it as a restricted access or keeping them from standing on it. Decrease that down to about 20%, right at 18% waste. And then with the hay ring, what they found was very similar what Dr. Lawman talked about with the hay ring with that skirt, about 13% waste. When they process that hay into a feeder, we're restricting access, they can't stand on it, and it's also chopping it up and mixing it, the wetter parts and long stem, stuff that they normally wouldn't consume. Altogether, there was only about 0.1% waste, so very little waste whenever they were using that hay processor. One of the other things that goes along with this is the nutrients it takes to, create a bale of hay. So whenever they're feeding in rings, this is another set of demonstrations we conducted. When you're feeding in rings, it concentrates the nutrients of the hay waste and the manure and urine in that spot, and it damages that feeding area. This can damage if we have a range side or even a really nice Bermuda grass field, we're having a place where we can basically grow smartweed and pigweed during the summer. So we're going to create a weed issue in that area, and it's also bad on the hygiene for livestock. If we start trying to calve when we're feeding a lot of hay, that leads to a lot of scour issues, and navel ill is another problem. That's the reason why we spray the navel with iodine at calving, is to keep from getting joint ill on our calves, and that's just from bad hygiene in our calving area. So our recommendation is to move our hay rings or our hay feeding sites whenever we do that. In that average Bermuda grass bale, that's about 8% crude protein. That's about 1.3% nitrogen. It's also about 1.3% potassium and 0.2% phosphorus. So 1 ton of Bermuda grass is about 24 pounds of nitrogen. So we're mining our soils of nitrogen. That's why we put fertilizer out on our hay meadows. It's about 4 pounds of phosphorus and 24 pounds of potassium. So that's what it takes that's what that hay is removing from a hay meadow whenever we are producing that hay. That's also, if we're buying our hay, that's also something we're buying from that hay producer. So it's a cost to the hay producer, and it's actually one of the benefits of buying your hay or importing it in. So here's I bought a couple of bags of 1717 fertilizer at A&M Milling the other day, and actually my wife did, and I borrowed them from her to make this point. These 1,400-pound bales of hay have the equivalent of 100 pounds of 1717 to produce the nitrogen, and that same 100 pounds of 1717 to replace the phosphorus that we're taking up. And it takes about 15 pounds of that fertilizer to replace your phosphorus. So 100 pounds of 1717 for the nitrogen and potassium, and about 15 for the phosphorus. That's $30 worth of fertilizer right there. So that's one bale. If you're selling that bale for $45, you're exporting $30 worth of nutrients that are eventually going to have to be replaced. So because of all that, we did some demonstrations where we did soil tests, and basically where we are feeding at that same spot. Everybody has that one spot where we really like feeding hay through the winter. because it's kind of maybe on a hill or it's right by the gate. It's something we can get to, whether it's a foot of snow on the ground or not. So we soil tested the surrounding pasture versus a concentrated hay feeding site, and then we looked at another field or another producer's location. Actually, there were several of them across the state, but we looked at moving the hay bale location in hay rings every time we fed hay in them. And then the third one, we had locations where we unrolled the hay across the field in a stepwise manner in about 8 acres throughout the winter. So I've got a slide there that shows the results from that. In the surrounding pasture, in these concentrated hay feeding sites, it was 186 pounds of phosphorus, 232 pounds of potassium, and 2.6% organic matter in that field. So it's not a real bad location, but in those sites, after feeding hay 1 year in about just about an acre area, the phosphorus went up to about 630 pounds, potassium at nearly 2,000 pounds, and the organic matter was 10%. So we're concentrating a lot of nutrients in that area, and as I said before, that area is basically going to grow. If it grows anything decent, it would be crabgrass, but most of it's going to be weeds that's going to grow up in that spot. In those other areas where we moved the hay rings every time we fed, it was very similar sites. It was before feeding, it was 165 pounds of phosphorus, 300 pounds of potassium, and 4% organic matter. Those locations between the hay feeders really didn't change. They were all about the same. But the hay feeding locations did increase to 200 pounds of phosphorus and 600 pounds of potassium and 5% organic matter. So we increased in those spots where we were feeding hay, but not as dramatically as if we fed it in the same spot all winter. Then when we looked at that last one, looking at just the pasture before and after we unrolled hay across that pasture all winter, it was 200 pounds of phosphorus, went up to 215 pounds of phosphorus. So about a 7% increase in phosphorus across that whole field in 1 year. 300 pounds of potassium increased up to about 450 pounds of potassium, and a slight increase in organic matter. So, that improved the nutrients across that whole field by unrolling. So, that being said, there's a lot of advantages to unrolling or moving our hay across those fields as we feed that hay, and a lot of it gets into the nutrients we're using to produce the hay, and in the best case, if we're producing hay, the best way to feed that back out to decrease the amount of fertilizer we're putting out to produce that hay is to feed it in the same location across that field, so we're spreading those nutrients back out. If we have dedicated hay meadows, whether it's a Bermuda grass hay meadow, we're going to take a lot of nutrients off from that, and we're going to have to replace it. Native grass prairie hay, also realize, if we don't replace that phosphorus and potassium, we're going to degrade that range site and have to replace those eventually. And that's why, as over time, if we don't fertilize our hay meadows, we always see a decreased production, and we blame it on, well, that was a bad variety of Bermuda grass, or it just didn't match my site. But a lot of it can be blamed on ourselves for especially not replacing that phosphorus and potassium as we're mining those nutrients.